disorders or mental health diagnoses.
Awesome. Well, thank you all very much for joining us today. Um, the and so we're going to say just for you have opportunity to interact in this session that and more time for Q&A. We did see a lot of you all's surveys from the last meeting and wanted more time with Dr. Kamesha, which we have given you. And so she has a lot of information to share. And so as we get ready to move forward, please, until the open discussions, keep your phones or computers muted, and then you'll have opportunity for breakout sessions as well. And so as we get ready to move forward into this session, I wanted to also say there was a news report I happened to see yesterday of a pastor who was having mental health issues in Texas, who was shot and killed by the police after coming to his home. And when we talk about mental health in the space of faith, and so one of the things that we are in response to that, we are putting together a forum just to talk about this and also to record it as a resource for pastors who are dealing with mental health issues, lay leaders who are dealing with mental health issues, and trying to find that balance of science and faith to help them get over some of those things. And quite honestly, I will say, as a pastor, community leader who also have had issues and struggles in mental health, it is a balance, and it took me a long time to agree with some of the science as it relates to my faith. And so and that took a long time, and so some things I probably could have prevented in my life or sought out help earlier in my life. And so one of the things we want to do is put together that panel and discussion and help for pastors around this and for their families as well. And so, if you want to be a part of that panel of discussion, please email me. I will put my email in the chat section. Let me know you want to be a part of that, the role you play, what you can bring to the discussion, and then we will get that scheduled ASAP. And so we're looking forward to today. Also, in the chat section, I have included some information about our presenter today, which you can read at your leisure. And at this time, I'm going to hand everything off to Miss Dolores Williams.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Welcome back to those of you that were with us previously to hear and learn from Dr. Kamesha. Welcome for the first time for those of you for whom this is your initial connection with us. I'm really more than excited about this effort and what grows out of it, particularly for the faith community. One of the things I've learned over the course of my career in the social services, but also as an ordained pastor myself, is that we've got a lot of folks that are struggling with this issue, both from a spiritual, moral perspective, but also just the basic information. And so I'm really pleased that each of you will be able to sit before Dr. Kamesha this morning and hopefully take something away. Our goal at the Mental Health and Recovery Services Board is to increase knowledge, literacy around behavioral health, particularly in this session related to suicide, and then also through that knowledge to decrease stigma. A lot of the research suggests that as stigma decreases, the awareness of mental illness as an illness increases. And I think that is a huge need in the faith community, but also in communities of color. And so Without further ado, I will hand this off to Dr. Kamesha. Please use the chat box as Charles has suggested, and we will have time throughout the course of the session for some Q&A. That is one of the huge pieces that we got in our feedback from the previous session. So don't hesitate. This is your opportunity to ask and learn. Welcome. You will be hearing from the Mental Health and Recovery Services Board again. Thank you.
Thank you, and welcome to everyone that's attending this morning. I've been excited about this for some time. I really enjoyed connecting with you all, those of you that were able to attend the last session. So I definitely look forward to our time together today. I'm going to take a moment just to share my screen so you can see the slides that I have prepared for you today. And so before we get started, I of course want to take just a moment to thank the Mental Health and Recovery Services Board of Lucas County, as well as Pastor Charles, for working closely with me to connect with you all today. So let's get started. We're just going to jump right in. And for those of you, it's been mentioned before, that didn't get a chance to see the previous webinar workshop, please take a look at that, because there are some things that I covered there that I think are really kind of fundamental to what we're going to talk about here today. So before, in the last session, I talked about one of the things that were kind of 3 points that I really wanted to bring your way, and it was how to identify which Black Americans rather are most at risk for suicide. Also, I kind of took a moment to unpack a little bit around what help seeking looks like for Black Americans, specifically between Black Americans in society, as well as Black Americans and in their church and faith community. And then also to develop a deeper level of awareness around some of the very unique opportunities that I think that the Black church has to do this sort of work. And so we kind of started with that last time, but today what I want to do is really focus on these 3 points. Today is more so going to be about giving you background information, and I call it a common language. In other words, so that when you hear the word, we all know what it means, around suicide prevention, suicide intervention, and suicide postvention. So those are words you're going to hear quite often as you do and dig more into this work. And so I just want to make sure we're clear on what those words mean. And then we're going to identify the different types of outreach activities for community faith leaders. So for those of you that attended the previous session, you know that I've been doing this work for just over 15 years. And specifically, the work that I've been doing has been dedicated to the Black community. So this is kind of my sweet spot. This is my passion. This is the community that I've worked with pretty much the entire time that I've been doing this. And so I've come to really discover the importance of kind of dismantling and deconstructing the whole idea of what an outreach activity is and what it can look like. Also, we're going to summarize the necessary steps for you all if you want to do more outreach activities, and if you want to start to think about the ways in which you can involve your church or your community organization in this particular type of work. We all know that COVID-19 is here and it's real. And so myself, as a race scholar, racial justice, health equity scholar, I am really concerned about what we might have kind of on our doorstep a year from now, right? So again, welcome, and let's get started. So I covered this last time, but I at least wanted to bring this back up just briefly. And I have a list here of the Black Americans that are most at risk. This is based on a lot of the research that we have been doing. Many of you may know this, that look at this topic. Looking at suicide among Black Americans, scientifically speaking, it's a very underrepresented topic. There's not a ton of research on the topic. There's more now than ever before, so I'm really hopeful there. But I thought it was critically important to bring to you at least a brief overview based on what the research is telling us regarding which groups are most at risk. So I noted this last time, there are certain age groups that are more at risk than others. Those tend to be youth. Specifically, we've noted an increase among Black children ages 5 to 11. We've also noted increases in the adolescent population, especially teenage girls. And then we've also noted an increase among Black males between the ages of 25 and 34. So I don't want to rush through this. I covered it before, but I do want you to be mindful of this particular slide in the content that I'm sharing here, because when we get to the section on discussing outreach activities, I want you to kind of be mindful of who the groups are. Also, geographic location. Specifically, the research shows that Black Americans that reside in the northeast portion of the country, as well as Black Americans that reside in the southern region of the country, appear to be more so at risk than other geographical locations. We see suicide more common in those areas. Also, social support. Those that, here I want you to think about individuals that have very little social support, very little family support, or very negative or tense interactions with their family for a variety of reasons. And then abuse victims. I noted before that those that have been or that have experienced childhood sexual abuse is also another group that where we're seeing suicide risk factors or risk rates highly affected by that, specifically among girls and women. But I mentioned before, there just hasn't been a ton of research on Black men that have been abused as children, sexually abused. So I wouldn't necessarily overlook that. Victims of racism and discrimination. Many of you on the call today or on the webinar today talked about working with children of color or in communities of color and kind of knowing and seeing like the impact of all of what we deal with in terms of racism and discrimination and how that can impact our mental health. So that's a really strong interest of mine, is really trying to find ways to unpack the impact, the real impact of what that means to live in America as a Black person. And so victims of racism and discrimination certainly appear to be more at risk than other groups within the Black community. And that would also include our LGBTQ members, in addition to others. So, and then marital status. Specifically here, the research talks about those that are widowed and divorced. So I'm not necessarily saying that these individuals, if you know somebody who's dealing with these sorts of things, that they are struggling with suicide. But what I am saying is when we look at the research and we can compile all of the kind of the life factors that the individuals that are being impacted by suicide have, these appear to be the factors that are most commonly noted. And then I also covered this last time, but I just want to briefly touch base. Frequently overlooked groups. When we think about suicide in general, we tend to think just about the individuals that have either attempted suicide or that have died already by suicide. And so these are three groups that I really want you to keep at the forefront of your mind, especially as you move forward, because not everybody's going to fall into that category that I just mentioned. We have those that contemplate, right? And so these are the self-reported thoughts of engaging in suicidal behavior. This may or may not necessarily lead to an attempt, but at this point, we're simply talking about the individuals that really think about it and then they report it to others. So that's a group worthy of attention. Those that attempt, and so here we're talking about the individuals that actually did attempt to harm themselves, specifically with the intent to kill themselves. And so when we think about outreach activities, which I'll kind of unpack that here in a moment, we also want to think about the individuals that attempt as well. So we're thinking, first, we're talking about those that have thought about it, seriously thought about it, because I think at some point we've all thought about it. You know, we've had difficult times or challenges in our life and we're thinking, you know, I don't know, this might just be better if I wasn't here. But I'm actually talking about seriously thinking about it. And specifically thinking about, well, how might I do it? Or what people might think if I do, you know, those sorts of things. But with the attempt, the thing to know about attempts is you don't always know who attempted. especially when we're looking at the Black community, because the research shows that we're less likely to seek help even for an attempt. And when we do, we're more likely to be in a much more serious state. Okay. And then we also want to be mindful of the survivors. Suicide as a topic in our community is very stigmatized as it is. And so it's not a group that I really want us all to be mindful of as we think about ways to do this work, outreach materials and things that we might want to pass out, or however we decide to do the material, or however we decide to move forward. We also want to think about the fact that there are people in our community that have lost a family member to suicide. Okay. And so here we're talking significant others, acquaintances, so on and so forth. And what the research tells us is for every survivor, in other words, for every family member that's still here, past or following the death of their loved one, at least 6 people in that family are intimately connected to that death. So if there's a loss by suicide, you have to average that there are at least 6 people that are going to need some sort of support. And then the research also shows that for every death, 147 people are affected. What does that mean? That could mean it could be the teacher of a child, it could be a community member, a neighbor. So maybe they're not as intimately connected as the family members might have been, but we certainly have to think about ways to not just support the individuals that have been intimately affected, but we also want to think about kind of a community effort, because oftentimes these folks are impacted as well. So this is kind of the meat and potatoes of today. I wanted to just take some time to remind you of some of that really critical information that we covered last time. And so I see this moving forward as taking the next 5 to 10 minutes to familiarize you with what an outreach activity is. Again, a number of you mentioned on the call or on the webinar that, hey, I have an interest in doing more of this work, or I have an interest in taking this back to my local community, in my faith community. And that is amazing. I am really excited about that. And so we tend to hear the word outreach and we think, oh my goodness, that's such a big word. I don't know where to start. What does it mean to outreach, to create an outreach activity? How do I move forward? Where do I start? So I'm going to unpack this for you a little bit. And part of this, majority of this is certainly based on the research that's been done in terms of what works and what are some of the efforts that you can do. But the other portion of this that I bring to you today is really having worked in the community for well over a decade and kind of getting a sense for what I think specifically Black communities might need to unpack a bit more than others. And specifically today, we're talking the faith-based community. So starting out, there's what we call destigmatizing efforts. Okay, that's what I call it, destigmatizing efforts. And you're going to see that there's a lot of overlap here, but I really want to push you a bit to begin to think about, what can I do in my own respective community? Where does my community members stand currently on the issue? And then what specific type of outreach activity might I want to think about next? So starting with destigmatizing, I define this as efforts aimed to break the silence and normalize conversations around suicide or suicidal behavior. So Pastor Charles just mentioned having a panel or a forum. That would certainly, in terms of the way I'm classifying this, fall under a destigmatizing effort. Now, the nice thing about this, and you'll see this on my speaker sheet that Pastor Charles put into the chat at the beginning of the session. But what's nice about this is one of my most requested topics in the Black community, I would have to say probably in the top 3 for sure, is shh, we can't talk about that, normalizing conversations about mental illness and suicide. And so I think because specifically in the faith-based community, in the Black community as well, stigma is really at the heart of what we're doing now, having to destigmatize the act of suicide or what it means to be suicidal, right? Those are going to be critical, specifically in our community, because these just aren't conversations historically that we've had. I'll share one of my dear friends, she has a family member that attempted suicide, and I think it happened back in the 1930s or 40s. But the family had just been instructed not to talk about that. So she kind of heard wind of what was happening, and this was maybe 6 months ago. And it was very clear that for generations, they had intently been asked not to disclose that to the younger folks and not to talk about that. And so that really kind of got her fired up about, okay, wait a minute, I'm struggling with this. I had no idea that a few generations ago, a family member was struggling with this. So we have to do something. So the next effort I want to make you aware of are awareness efforts. They're similar in the sense that, you know, when you contribute and when you share information, it certainly helps to destigmatize. But I look at awareness efforts as proactive efforts to raise awareness around suicidal behavior, right? And so these efforts are incredibly helpful, and they require very little resources. And most of the time they require very little planning. So awareness efforts might be something as simple as putting out pamphlets or suicide statistic sheets or flyers in the lobby after the church service. It could be printing a little bit of information, or, you know, an outreach activity, or the suicide crisis text line phone number on the bottom of the church program. There are a number of ways to do this. Awareness doesn't have to be this big grand conference where you're bringing in speakers from all over the world. It can be very, very simple. And what I like about that is I've just seen churches do some very creative things. I attended a church service where when I walked out in the lobby, on the table, there were mental health clinicians' business cards, and they were, you know, Black. They specifically wanted to put Black folks, you know, expose their businesses in terms of from the clinical standpoint. And so when people left, they saw, okay, if I need a therapist, and I specifically want a Black one, because most of the folks that I work with always tell me, Dr. Spates, I want to go to therapy, but I need to find a Black person. And so the church was very specific about putting that information out on the table, business cards and things like that, for how to access the individual should they so need it. And I also asked Pastor Charles to complete or to share with you, there's a flyer that I printed from NAMI, which is the National Alliance of Mental Illness. If I got that right, I hope I did. But nonetheless, you can put that in the chat now. It's the flyer that says info warning signs handout. So I'll have Pastor Charles put that in there now. And you could simply print something like this, and literally that's considered an awareness effort. So it doesn't have to be anything grand. The other thing I want to mention too is that Amy, she presented at the last session. And if you start the previous presentation about an hour and 38 minutes in, she literally gave about 20 minutes worth of materials that are specific to Lucas County, which I was incredibly impressed with. And one was, you can become a QPR trainer and train folks in your community. She talked about that. That's question, persuade, and refer, just to get you familiar with how to have conversations with people and persuade them to get help, and then refer them when they need it. But nonetheless, when we think about outreach activities, we can start to kind of pick apart really tangible things that you can begin to do in your day-to-day lives to get the word out as it relates to suicide. So I have this third one underlined, and this is because traditionally, the research talks a lot about prevention efforts and intervention and postvention. And that was part of what I wanted you to walk away with, is a common language around what does it mean to participate in or to lead a prevention effort. So prevention efforts are defined as activities that you implement prior to the onset of an adverse health outcome. So in this case, we're talking suicide. And then these efforts are specifically designed to reduce as well as to prevent suicide. or suicidal behaviors or thoughts. And so some organizations or some, and these are just some ideas for you all, because what I don't want you to begin to feel like is, well, I have to know all this stuff myself. I'm just learning. I have no idea where to start. There are a ton of resources that are already present where you can either download them to your computer, you can blast them on your Instagram, you can print them and put a PowerPoint slide in front of the church service that just continues to kind of play and roll. And so there's a ton of information that you can tap into that's already there. But in terms of prevention resources, sometimes organizations will bring in speakers to share their stories. I know of one speaker, if you're interested in particular, she's amazing. She attempted suicide multiple times and then eventually got help. And then she's now very passionate about sharing her journey with Black members of the community and specifically within the Black church. And so feel free to reach out to me if you're interested in that. But also there's a link. I wonder if I'll revisit the link toward the end. But there's also a link that I'm providing both on the slides, which I'm happy to share if you're interested in these, but also I sent that link to Pastor Charles, and it's the NAMI website where you can literally download all sorts of resources. There's also another site that I think you should take a look at. It has a toolkit where you can download pretty much anything you need, everything from stickers, if you want to put a bumper sticker on your car, or if you want to pass out bookmarks to the kids, whatever it may be. So there's a ton of information there in order to help you with that. Also, Lucas County Suicide Prevention Coalition, according to Amy in her conversation last time, they're all about raising awareness and addressing stigma through trainings, conferences, and providing education and support. So you could even say, okay, my congregation and I are going to contact the Lucas County Suicide Prevention Coalition and have them send someone out to do something on a Wednesday night, right? So just think about some of the activities that you could do. And then next, which is well noted in the research and in the literature, it's intervention efforts. So an intervention effort is something that you think about where an individual has already expressed concern or an interest, or that they're to an extent planning, they have a plan in place, but the intervention efforts are literally here to help alter the course of the suicide outcome. So this is what you might want to do if you're working with a group of high-risk individuals. Let's say, I think it was, I forget which one of the speakers mentioned that they work specifically with children that have and adolescents that have depression and those sorts of things. So you might want to look at an intervention effort to kind of alter it, which is aimed at altering the outcome. Now, I mentioned the Lucas County QPR training opportunity. That would be a great way to do some intervention efforts in your local communities and your faith communities. Again, I believe Amy mentioned that they are looking for trainers to get trained, that they will pay them, and then they'll actually pay them each time they offer the training to the community members. Also, Amy mentioned, and I was familiar with this before, the crisis text line. That's a worldwide number. You can reach it anywhere in the world, and you text with a clinician or trained individual to help you to deal with any sort of suicidal thoughts or mental health crises that you might be facing. What's nice about that is you can also text via Facebook. So again, think about, as we kind of process this, we could look at this from the destigmatization route. We could also look at this through the awareness route, prevention. Now we're talking intervention. Of course, they all kind of overlap and inform one another, but just start unpacking what might be helpful for you and your local community. And then we have post-vention efforts, okay? So there's 5 in total in terms of the types of outreach activities that I'm presenting to you here today. This is the 5th one. And so post-vention is really aimed at suicide survivors. These are individuals that have lost someone to suicide, or these also could be individuals that have attempted a suicide. They're called attempt survivors, right? So these would be, you might want to offer these in cases where you know that an individual is facing some sort of emotional distress or in need of support to prevent additional trauma and contagion. So I live out in the Akron area, and back in 2018, Stark County, it made the national news. Stark County was having what we call in the research a suicide cluster. And so what was happening is there had been an individual initially that had taken their life in the high school, or he was a high schooler. And at that point, between the loss of the initial student and about 8-9 months later, there had been 11 other suicides from the high schoolers. And so we call that a suicide cluster, sorry about that, or contagion. So postvention efforts is literally about making sure we don't necessarily just gloss over this. It's happened, it needs to be addressed, and we need to do that in order to avoid further traumatizing any of the individuals that might be in contact or have known this person. And so they sent the Center for Disease Control in, and they did some work around that. But again, people were very specific about making sure that they didn't lose any additional children from this. So I also asked Pastor Charles to post there's a research article that I think is very helpful. They're few and far in between when it comes to African American communities, but there was a research study done not too long ago where the scientists were exclusively focusing on how to provide postvention support in the Black community. So I'll have him share that article as well for your future reference, and we can talk more about this when we get to Q&A if you have specific questions. So now we're going to get to really this kind of interactive part of our time together today. Because there were, up to now, I wanted to help you to develop a common language around prevention, intervention, and postvention. In other words, when you hear the word, what does it mean? And so hopefully at this point, we kind of understand and we've unpacked the differences between those words. But also to identify different types of outreach activities for community faith leaders, as well as, you know, many of you are involved in a number of organizations that I think would be very, very, very helpful for you all to think about. So I know you might be thinking, well, I didn't get on the webinar today to kind of craft or develop an outreach activity. And that's okay, I understand that. But what I find the more I do this work is if you can think about and become very intentional and conscious about integrating this sort of thing into what you do on a daily basis, you know, not necessarily overpowering people with knowledge and information from the beginning, I think you will realize without even much effort, you're actually doing outreach work, right? So outreach work can be as simple as sending a text to family and friends just to check in to see how they're doing. But of course, I've mentioned a number of ways that you can do this. Now, the other thing that's important to note is I want you to think about the subpopulation that you would target. So what do I mean by subpopulation? I mean that in the Black community, you all know this, we are not homogeneous. We do not all deal with the same thing the same way. I have younger cousins. I have a 5-year-old, so she's too young for this, but I have family members that's on social media and they're on TikTok and they're on things that I've never heard of yet, right? And so that's a subpopulation. Age differences. These are all subpopulations within the Black communities. Ethnic distinctions. I think Brother Muhammad was on the call, on the webinar last time. He's not here today, but he doesn't attend a Black church. He attends a mosque, right? He's Muslim. So we have to think about the varying subpopulations. And so I say this to say, outreach activities that you might do with elderly Black Americans may need to look very different if you're working with adolescents, okay? So I want you to just take a moment to think about the subpopulation. If you could wave a magic wand and create some sort of outreach activity, and again, I hope that I've unpacked outreach activity. It doesn't have to be anything massive. But if you were to do anything, which subpopulation within the Black community might you target? I also mentioned before that Caribbean Black men attempt suicide more than any other subpopulation within the Black community. We don't know why. I haven't seen any scientific indications or preliminary information as to why, but that might be a group you might want to focus on. But obviously, many of you are here, you're members of the faith-based community. So you might say, I'm specifically going to focus on Black Christians, and that's the population that I want to target. So I'm going to give you just a minute to think about that. And if you already know, go ahead and put that information into the chat so we can begin to think about how you're processing this. So again, subpopulations could be age, could be ethnic differences, could be sexual orientation, could be religion or faith, could be geographical location. Take a moment to consider the subpopulation that you would target. And if you'd like, you're welcome to unmute and just tell the group what type. Take a moment to consider the subpopulation, rather, that you would target in this work.
Hi, Dr. Spates.
Hi.
Hi. I'm not necessarily sure if I would want to be the one to target this group, but there's a need.
Right?
So our son, in fact, he just turned 27 just a few days ago. We found out back in maybe 2013 that he was diagnosed with bipolar.
Mm-hmm.
And we've been through it all, suicide attempts, several hospitalizations, you name it. And you know, we were these Bible-toting, Holy Ghost-filled Christians who thought that we could cast a demon out and, you know, all of the above, knew nothing about mental illness until that hit our home. And even now, all of his friends are people who suffer with the same type of disease. So if I could target any subgroup, it would be these young adults who, even though I think for the most part he stays on his meds, but man, they believe in that weed. So, oh my goodness.
Yep.
So and so I don't know, like, what else is there? What else can you give them to do? You know, no matter how much you pray or,
sure.
I don't know. I'm just at a loss. It's never hit my house before. I don't know how to deal with it. We don't necessarily know how to deal with it, but there is a need.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, that, and I'm going to come back to a few things that you said when we get to the next step, but that's an excellent, like I mentioned before, Black males between the ages of 25 and 34, in terms of risk, looking specifically at those individuals that are at risk, that would certainly fall into that category. So thank you for sharing that. Feel free to hop in if there's anybody else, but I'm seeing all sorts of things on the chat: teens, preteens, millennial age, men and women, adolescents on the north side of Toledo, those who've lost, African-American males who've lost their mother at a young age. Oh, that's really specific. I love that.
Yes, and Dr. Kamesha, I was one of those young African-American males who lost his mother from for the most part, a single parent at a very young age. When she became terminally ill, I wasn't even quite a teenager yet. And so I was like, what am I going to do? And had I not had such great family support on both sides of my family. My mother and father who were divorced when I was very young. My father was always in my life, so he literally took up, he just grabbed me and finished raising me along with the family on both sides. I do not know where I would have ended up if I did not have that family support. And initially, suicide was was on my mind. Absolutely.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. I
Thank
think
you.
the other piece of what you just reminded me of is just the importance of visibility, right? In our community, we really need to begin to share that, hey, I struggle with suicidal thoughts, or I've been diagnosed with depression, or I see a therapist, because oftentimes, especially with the youth, when I'm out, and women specifically too, when I'm out talking to them about these sorts of things, they're like, well, I didn't mention it because I don't know anybody. I don't know any other Black person that has dealt with this. And I'm like, oh, trust me, they're there. But we have to become more open and vulnerable and willing to share those experiences, because then that gives other people permission to say, okay, I'm not the only one. And one of the biggest myths, I'm not talking about that today, I have a workshop on this, but is that suicide's a white thing, right? And so we have to increase the visibility of what it looks like, kind of change the view of what it looks like or what an individual looks like that might be dealing with suicidal thoughts or depression. Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. All right. So we'll take maybe one more.
I have a question.
Yes.
Sometimes children take things into their adult lives. How do we get to them before they get to that point, because they were raised with domestic violence or sexual assaults and things like that? Shouldn't we start before they get there, before maybe they even think about suicide, to stop that?
Yes. Thank you for asking that question. The more proactive we can be, the better. And so here's what I would say. If you look at when you see my speaker bio, you'll see on there that I note that I'm a trauma survivor, right? Childhood sexual abuse and some other things. So I think that if you know of an individual, whether they're a child or an adult, that has dealt with, let's say, an individual, they have a family member or a parent that's been incarcerated. Let's say they've dealt with some sexual abuse, or let's say they have a family member that died when they were very young, or let's say they've been in the foster care system. We could think of a host of issues, right? That or challenges that might really strain or put strain on our mental health and mental well-being. We want to get those kids into some sort of support group, mentorship program, and I'm gonna say therapy as soon as possible. So that's an excellent question. As soon as possible. We don't want to wait, because the research is very clear on the health outcomes. I'll share, feel free to Google this. It's called ACEs. It's Adverse Childhood Experiences. It's a 10 questionnaire with 10 questions. What am I trying to say? And if you answer, I took this personally, and I think I answered an 8. If you answer anything above a 4 or 5, the research is crystal clear that there are negative health conditions or negative health outcomes that can come about if you don't intervene, right? So we're clear, and we're not just talking suicide, depression, and mental illness. We're also talking diabetes, high blood pressure, and other issues. So I encourage you to look up ACEs. It's a 10-point questionnaire, and take it yourselves. You'll be surprised, because when you're raised in an environment with these sorts of things, chances are you have definitely some trauma that you're facing and that you're going to have to deal with. Great question. All right, let's go to step 2. Step 2. So now that you've thought about and keep this subpopulation in mind. Identify the type of outreach activity that you think might suit your needs. I have some resources here. Don't worry about trying to copy them. Pastor Charles has shared those in the chat room. They're also going to be on a slide later in this presentation for you to utilize, and I'll get the slides out to you if you're interested. But take a moment to identify the type of outreach activity that best suits your needs. So remember, we've talked about destigmatization. We've talked about awareness, prevention, intervention, and postvention. I've shared 5 of those. And so now that you have the target population in mind, like I mentioned before, the outreach activity might look very different. You might include social media if you're working with younger folks, whereas you might include, a one-on-one forum where people need to be socially connected. A group forum where people need to be socially connected and see and hear and touch the resources. So I'm a college professor too, and I found that some of my non-traditional students, and even my mom's 61 years old, she's in college now. She doesn't care how many resources she can get on the computer. She needs to print those things out and hold them. So what kind of outreach activity, identify the type of outreach activity you might do with this particular group. And many of you, if you want, you can certainly share. Before you do, let me just show you what I have on the slide. I have a link to NAMI's website where you can download. I'm telling you, there's probably hundreds of resources you can just download and put on the table. If you want to be more closely connected, though, there's some other things that you can do, facilitate conversations. They have questions, you can ask them, so on and so forth. The Suicide Prevention Resource Center has some PowerPoint slides. You can literally print those out. You can put them on in the lobby. I know in my university, in the lobby, when you walk in, there's kind of this little screen, and it's just this constant recurring, revolving PowerPoint slide that goes on. Starting on slide 35, the information is specifically about Black Americans. And then, like I said, there's a toolkit, and BIPOC stands for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color. Awareness toolkit specifically aimed at mental health awareness and suicide prevention. So does anyone want to share? What kind of outreach activity might you do with your subpopulation?
As far as with my subpopulation, I would want to engage Black males who are struggling with the loss or absenteeism of their biological father. Not saying that there's not a male role model in their life, but the fact that they don't have that actual biological father. And honestly, I think I would want to start younger, around between 3rd and 4th grade.
Absolutely.
The reason being is because in middle school, it's just that much harder in order to kind of reach them or get them into that mindset of it's okay, because at that time there's a lot of bravado. Oh, I'm okay, I'm good, I don't need him. But then they fluctuate because they yearn so bad to have them, but then at the same token they feel rejected, and they're trying to come to terms with that rejection. And so this is from personal experience, because my oldest son, even though I've been married for most of his life, he doesn't have that biological father. But also, as a former foster care supervisor, working with that population, when kids are in care, I don't care what was done to these kids by the hands of their parents, 9 times out of 10, they still are missing that piece, and they want to return, and oftentimes do return to their parents after they reach adulthood. So I feel like if we can almost kind of close that, not close it necessarily, but fill it, put something into that empty space that they're feeling at that time when they're young, and ingraining it in them, teaching them how to shoot a ball, hit a baseball, small things, tying a tie, things like that, and being done by a male that looks like them. Yes. Not necessarily just a male, but a male that looks like them, and being able to bring in, other people who have, because I wouldn't want to do it alone as a female, because females are always in everything. But I would look for, males, who may have come from that same background, or maybe they didn't, but I would be looking for males, of both structures who look like these students in order to assist them on that journey.
That's an excellent point, and thank you for sharing your personal story with your son as well. So I'm going to push you a bit further. What type of outreach activity would you do? Would you say stigmatize, raise awareness, prevent, intervene, or postvention?
So for me, I can't say, I would have to break down the stigma. Because at that point, you can't necessarily prevent it because it's already occurred. But breaking down the stigma of that, you are wanted, you're not less than, people still love you. Just because they're choosing not to embrace you as a beautiful person doesn't mean that you're not worthy. So I would say it would be breaking down the stigmatism. And as far as like doing that outreach, personally, I would start in the schools. I work for the school system now, but I would start in the schools and do like, you know, unfortunately, we don't have enough mentors, but do like a wide sweep, because at least 80% of our students are in single parent households for one reason or another.
Yeah, and I think I'm going to second that, Tanisha. I think that's an excellent point. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, Black children between the ages 5 and 11 historically have their suicide rates have passed those of white children for the first time in history. And that happened just a few years ago. Researchers are really baffled. We're doing our best to kind of figure out what's going on. But nonetheless, 5 to 11, I used to get parents asking me, well, is it too young? You know, how young or how old should the child be? Are they too young at 7 and 6? And I'm like, listen, I have multiple cases that I'm kind of downloaded information on where I can literally show you the faces of these children between the ages of 5 and 11. So not too soon. Great point. Anybody else want to talk about the outreach activity that would best suit your population? You can put it in the chat as well, but anybody willing to talk about, since you've already identified your subpopulation you'd focus on, what type of outreach activity do you think you might want to start with? There's no right or
Dr. Kamesha, so some of the things, just working with youth over a number of years, and just some of the things that we have done has really given us some insight on just dealing with this topic. And so I would do activities like I'll do a girls' night out. But the topic, and so we'll come in and do some fun things. We'll do a meal, and then I will have a speaker come in. And we would talk about dating, the dating abuse. We would talk about bullying. We would talk about human, trafficking. And so, or we'll talk about body image. And so those are kind of the preludes of the topics, but it has never failed that when we really start pulling back the layers and we create a space for these young ladies, and I work with the teens between the ages of 14 and up to 21. And I also invite some, ladies in that's going to college and some leaders from the community. But it was really powerful when they begin to share their story. Yes. And when you create the right atmosphere and it is no pressure, it only takes one person to start sharing their story, and it's like a ripple effect.
Oh yeah.
And so much, if we've gained, me and my staff have gained so much information by just setting the atmosphere to where it's safe and everybody's sharing. No one sits in the back of the room. No one sits back in the corner with a pad and a pen. We all sit in a circle and we are all sharing our experience, as women, as female, no matter what, your age. There is a connection, just being female, when we talk about dealing with abuse, and so because we do target youth from poverty, from foster care system that's been involved in the judicial system, and so it's amazing when you kind of do it that way, where you give them the right to pass. You don't have to share, but by the end of the night, we're crying, we're hugging, we're able to kind of pinpoint some of the ladies that may have shared something that was like, that we probably need to follow up on. And so then we would probably pull her out and maybe even at a later date and have that conversation with that young lady. So it's a way to do it in a way where it's not so scary and it's not invading your personal space or information. And once you begin to do it that way, and you understand that you're connecting the stories, because it's not only you that's gone through it. Here's a young lady over here. And I tell you, it has really been effective with us being able to identify just who needs additional help or therapy in those sessions. So that's one of the tools that we use to kind of begin to pull back the layers.
Yeah, so that I think even from Tanisha's point, and then Crystal, and I think Debbie mentioned a few things too, where it almost sounds like as you unpack this and think about the subpopulation you'd focus on, and many of you are faith leaders, right? So that's a very clear pathway, because when you are a member or a part of, or you work very closely with a subpopulation, you have a great deal of what we call taken for granted knowledge, right? So there's research on stuff, but then there's taken for granted knowledge that you can only get through your lived experiences of working with these populations every day, or parenting a son, or having lost a mother or parent at a very young age. And so don't discount the wealth of knowledge you already have about a subpopulation, because that's what it takes to actually reach them. And then also to think about, well, how do I not just reach them, but how do I reach them where they are on their platform? So thank you for sharing that. And it sounds like most of you all would focus on destigmatizing first, and then kind of transition into some other things. And that's certainly great. I really, for instance, in my workshop where I really normalize the conversation around mental illness and suicide, I'm really big on tackling that social climate, because every environment that you enter into, there are going to be cultural beliefs and there are going to be cultural attitudes about this topic. And I think unpacking that first really does kind of set the stage for other areas of growth. And then lastly, I want you to take into account the needs of your targeted outreach group. Ms. Crystal, you were already talking about that. You're like, these kids have been in foster care. Some of them have dealt with abuse, all sorts of other things. So even to just step back and say, okay, I know I have information and I know I want to start a conversation, but what are the needs of the group? One of my dear friends is a teacher and she says this all the time. You cannot reach these children in terms of teaching them and educating them if you have no idea what they need and what they're going through outside of the classroom. They, if they're going home and they don't have, their lights are off, or they're seeing their parent in a domestic abuse situation, or they're being sexually abused, who's gonna wanna learn, or who can learn in those sorts of environments, right? So and it doesn't have to always be these sorts of things. It could be like my mom. I mentioned my mom is 61 years old. Don't give her anything virtually. It's going to get deleted. She won't be able to find it. You got to give her a paper copy. So just taking into account the needs of your target outreach group. I call this a needs assessment. Pastor Charles just put a link in the box. I am really, and I've been looking at this particular conference for some time that I personally want to attend. It's the National Suicide and the Black Church Conference. They didn't have it in 2020 because of COVID, but they're 9 years into it now. And this is down in Tennessee, the Memphis area. And here's a link. You can take a look at the previous programs from year to year. You can take a look at what they've done, the sort of sessions that they offer. You could look to do something like this in the Toledo area, or begin something like this in the Toledo area. Could make it virtual, doesn't matter. But I say this to say, if your subpopulation is the Black church, then these are some tools that you could potentially look at. Like I said, they have programs, they have sessions, they have ideas. I've provided you with a wealth of resources too that you can share with others in the Black church or in your own community organizations. But does anybody want to share? I heard a few of you already talk about the needs of your population that you chose. And you can put any of this in the chat if you'd like. Some may be working. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, particularly, sometimes the need goes unaddressed, particularly. So I had two populations I was thinking about, particularly young men that struggled not so much from an absentee father, but also an absentee mother, and how that affects relationships, particularly marital relationships and dating relationships, and affected that. But also pastors who creating a safe space, and sometimes that space where in a world that no one trusts each other, oftentimes every pastor, we always say this, every pastor should have a pastor. Unfortunately, sometimes pastors choose pastors based on platforms they can get to versus the impact in their lives they can have. And so I've always regardless of who a mentor may have been on a different platform, I've always maintained my pastor, who definitely has impacted my life and that can speak into my life, has known me for nearly 20 plus years, that can, you know, enrich me. But we find that there is no space. So that need is that space for them to
Yes.
be able to be vulnerable, and where they can even access professionals without having it more so spread out all over, and that people that can understand that population.
You bet. So I assume your subpopulation would probably be Black pastors, right?
Yes.
Excellent. Oh, there's such a need there. And so destigmatizing, creating that space, letting folks know it's okay to be vulnerable, you can trust, those sorts of things. That is an excellent place to start. I really hope you do. No pressure. I hope you do.
Working on it.
Yes. That is wonderful. All right. And so here's just a little, if you're still thinking, well, you know, I know the population, but I have no idea how I would reach them, or some things that I need to keep in mind in terms of this needs assessment. Here's a few outreach kind of equity questions that I always ask. I share this with consulting clients and things like that. But some of the questions that you might want to ask is this my first time attempting to do any outreach work in this particular community with this particular subpopulation? Because if it is, you need to step back and kind of really think about how to approach this, especially when you're dealing with the youth. And I'm going to a little more and say Black men. You don't want to burn your bridges before you really get started. You really want to understand what it means, how they're perceiving your presence and that sort of thing before you go into the environment and do anything, particularly if we're looking to destigmatize and create safe spaces. And so the question is, have you talked with key stakeholders? Many key stakeholders are on this call, on this webinar today, and just kind of asking other, for instance, for Pastor Allen, other Black pastors, like, you know, other key stakeholders, what their thoughts are. In other words, have you attempted to gauge the community? Have you considered the age composition of the individuals that would participate? Are there various ethnic groups represented in the community? I mentioned on the last call, I've done some work on trauma-informed care and suicide and mental health awareness over in Kenya, Nairobi, Kenya. And there are various ethnic differences there. These are still Black folks, but there are ethnic differences there that I didn't necessarily know about when I initially started doing the work. Have you considered religious preferences? Have you considered relevant cultural specific factors of the population that you're looking to serve, both from a historical standpoint and contemporary? When we're talking about Black Americans, there's certainly pervasive mistrust of the healthcare system, but not just the health, in the healthcare system also includes mental health clinicians, therapists, right? And there's very clear, strong research that say when we do go and we seek mental health therapy, we're more likely to be misdiagnosed, we're more likely to be overdiagnosed, we're more likely to be over-medicated, right? So, and then are there people of different races, genders, ages, and classes represented in your outreach material? If I was doing something outreach-wise, I might do it very different if I was at a college campus versus if I was at a boys or girls club. And then are your outreach materials formatted for those that have accessibility issues? So I mentioned my mom, I keep bringing up my mom. If the letters on the page are not large, you can forget it. I don't care how important the information is that you put on the paperwork. So, I mean, just thinking about these things when you move forward to reach out and to do some sort of outreach activity, think about, okay, have I considered all of these things or a few of these things to make sure that I'm reaching the people that I'm seeking to reach? And then next, when you think about this, increasing effectiveness of outreach activities, many of you have already noted, trust is big. Going in and doing outreach activities, it's one thing where you're printing some pamphlets and you want to make sure they're accessible for people to get. That's one thing. You don't necessarily have to deal with the trust piece there. But nonetheless, if you're looking to do anything where you're trying to unpack stigma, increase visibility of what it means or looks like to have a mental illness or to have dealt with suicidal behavior, prevent, I'd even say intervene. Oftentimes from the research that I have done, Black Americans will tell me, yeah, organizations came in, they created these big efforts, they spent a whole lot of money on giving us this information, but they didn't ask us what we wanted, or they didn't ask us what we needed. So trust, building rapport. I think it was Crystal that talked about, I sit down and talk with these kids. I'm in the circle with them. I'm sharing right there with them. It doesn't always have to be that way, but just the importance of building rapport is key. And then needs assessment, thinking about what they need. Those are all really important to increase the effectiveness of outreach activities. And then this is my last slide, and then I'm going to open the floor for Q&A. But there's just a few things that I want to end with, because essentially today I kind of brought forth some content. I really want to get you thinking. I really wanted you to have an understanding of what it means to prevent or have prevention efforts versus intervention versus postvention. I want you to know what the 5 types of outreach activities are, kind of think of these as possibilities. And then I also wanted you to kind of have a sense for, being able to summarize or think about, really put yourself out there and say, hypothetically, if I were to ever do anything in this area, what might it look like? You all have great ideas, way more interesting to hear and read than some of the research that's out there. So there's a wealth of knowledge here as well. But I would say destigmatizing efforts are vital to outreach with Black Americans. I think I would almost argue it's the starting place. Because when we're talking specifically about suicide, I encounter, and I have encountered this for years and years and years, it's a white thing. It's not something we do. It's not something we do, nor it's not something we talk about, right? So really to unpack that, and specifically if we couple that with the notion that suicide is a sin and some of the moral dilemmas that really kind of complicate these conversations, it's important to begin by destigmatizing. Not saying it's the only way to do it, but I think it's important specifically in our community. Suicide efforts should match the population characteristics for individuals that you're attempting to reach. So if you are doing an outreach effort, you need to be mindful of who you're talking to. Age, you got to speak their language. These are subpopulations that have their own way of talking, their own way of communicating, their own platforms. And so just to think about that, and then to involve key stakeholders, other individuals that are there already, the subpopulation trusts them, they're already engaged, that can give you some of that taken for granted knowledge that you can only get sometimes from being there day to day and being kind of in there with them. So including stakeholders at each part of the planning process. And then also, this is key here, this last point, representations and information used in awareness and prevention information should be specific to the subgroup that you are seeking. I can recall doing some work, lots of planning, lots of resources, sharing the information. And I remember one of the adolescents said, but everybody on this flyer is white. And I'm like, okay, why didn't I think of that? And so, so last year I did some work up in Cleveland, the Northeast Ohio area, Cleveland in particular, but other parts too. And that was one of the things that my study showed. It's like, if you're going to bring me anything about suicide prevention, like they'll say, well, I saw the commercial, but it wasn't for us. Or I saw the billboard, but it wasn't for us. So I don't necessarily think I have to tell this audience this, but just representation and information used in the materials that you provide, if you provide them. So if you provide statistics, try and find statistics on Blacks, right? Black teens, if that's who you're seeking. The Black elderly, if that's who you're seeking. I know some of that information isn't readily available, but just do your best to get as close as you can. And make sure that that information is specific to the subgroup, like I mentioned before, that you are seeking to reach. So these are just kind of some additional tips. I mentioned before, there's some additional resources. Pastor Charles have been dropping them in the chat all along. I've compiled them here for you to reference should you want to do so. Amy in Lucas County has provided a wealth of resources for you. I know Pastor Charles sent those local Lucas County resources out in previous emails. I'm sure if you didn't get it or can't find it, he can provide that for you again so that you have Lucas County specific information. But I am honored and pleasured to be here with you today. And I look forward to taking any questions that you have.
Hi, Dr. Spates. I have a question.
Hi, I'm going to hop out of here and so I can see you all again. 1 second. Okay. Okay, I don't know what that means. Sorry about that. Give me 1 second. Okay. There we go. Perfect. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Am I still sharing my screen?
No.
Okay, perfect.
Oh, you're
Hi.
not.
Hello. I have a question. So I was wondering, how much research have you come across as it relates to disposition of mental illness or suicide? I assessed a young man last night, and he shared with me that both his paternal and maternal grandfather committed suicide, and 2 of his maternal uncles committed suicide. And I found myself just thinking how that plays into his thinking, into his mindset. And so I'm just wondering, how much research have you come across that talks about disposition? Being early disposed.
Sure. No, that's a great question. So there is a great deal of that. I will say, because I focus exclusively on, prefer my passion. I mean, I can't just look at suicide among Black folks without looking about suicide in its totality. But I will say the majority of the research that I've seen about that doesn't account for race. It's just talking about suicide. But what's very clear in that research is that if you have a family member, particularly a parent, that has died by suicide, you are much more at risk than you would be otherwise. I'm not necessarily sure it's clear on why that is. It could be a combination of mental illnesses that you may be predisposed for if you have another family member that has that, or if it could just kind of be environmentally speaking, like this is it's more acceptable, so to speak, because there is someone that's done it, so it's not like something you hear about that's out there. But absolutely. And so to say a parent, did you say a grandparent too?
Both grandparents and 2 uncles.
Man, yeah, for sure. And that's very traumatic, right? This is a child you're talking about, or a teenager rather.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear your question.
A teenager you're talking about?
He was a young adult.
Young adult, okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a lot to unpack.
Early 20s, actually.
Oh man, that's a lot. Absolutely. So in other words, to answer your question, the research is clear, much more at risk. Got to really keep an eye on the level of support, and just, that's a grieving process, right? Like, how do you unpack that and get through that when it's one individual, let alone a grandparent and some uncles?
Exactly. And you're dealing with substance use. So
which is
a lot
related. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Yes.
Sort of, kind of. We've just experienced a suicide in our family a week ago, and from a young lady in her early 20s. She lived out of town, and from my understanding that there were no signs, there were no symptoms. How can we recognize that silence? Because our family say that they didn't know, or they weren't expecting these things. And she was in her early 20s and she committed suicide about a week ago. How do we recognize the silent killers, so to speak?
That's a great question. I'm sorry for your loss. So here's what I would say to that. Many times we don't know the signs to recognize them. So my question, or one of the things that I would want to know more about, is her, and whether or not there were signs. Oftentimes what we see when an individual does ultimately lose their life to suicide is there were signs. And in hindsight, after you process and think about, a week might be too soon, but just thinking about what all transpired in let's say the year prior to her life, I bet there were some sort of signs. And I could say, I'm happy to share information with you on what the warning signs are. But what I find too is, even if it wasn't the family members, let's say mom and dad, that noticed the signs, oftentimes there were friends, There were folks she may have gone to school with. You said she was in her 20s, so maybe she wasn't in school. And there's even some research that I've been looking into not long ago on how those signs can play out in virtual environments, right? So we're on social media, we're doing these things, but there actually are, there is some research that talks about signs that are displayed even in your virtual communities and in your social media communities. So even though those closest to her, at least at this time, don't recognize what the signs may have been, I would be really hard pressed to think that nobody noticed anything at any point. And if so, it's likely because they're not sure what the signs are. Yeah.
Because I was wondering, like,
if I can add to that, one of the resources that we shared at the first session can equip the community to further recognize those signs. The mental health first aid course that is available to any group that would like to pull people together to participate, or the QRP training. Both of those can, the goal of both of those actually is to help the community, family, neighbors be able to recognize those symptoms. Dr. Kamesha, I mean, that's our understanding as well, that it's rare when an individual completes a suicide and there were no signs.
Yes.
Part of what our community really needs is the awareness of what it looks like and then how to intervene. So feel free to give us a call if you're interested and can pull a group together to go through that training. There's no cost, or no cost to you. The board has set aside funds for that. The more we know, the more we're better equipped to be able to help our communities prevent some of the death.
I'd even say if you do the QPR training, for instance, I have a colleague that was trained QPR, and she does all her trainings virtually, because she said, I don't just want to reach the people in my city, like Black folks everywhere need to be a part of this. So she does this, you know, so let's say you get trained in Lucas County and you want to reach out and train your family member, you know, train the ones that are, you know, back local. Definitely that could be a wonderful avenue for you to do that. And then also kind of really begin to think about supporting them. They're going to need some support after this loss.
Because I was just wondering if this was another situation where we don't do that. Black people don't do that, you know, with the family. You know, I had been speaking to some of the family, and we just don't think we do that doesn't happen, or we don't want anybody to know that this has been contemplating with my child. You know, I don't want nobody to know that because we don't do that, you know, so, but yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a huge cultural narrative that I think we're all kind of battling against as we do this work.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, my family members tell me that. They're like, why are you, what are you doing? Why are you working on suicide? Black folks don't do that. And I'm like, listen, sit down. I got all kinds of things I can show you here.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
We had another question in the chat. What can you recommend to a family that is determined to do a suicide intervention on a family member without professional help and nothing set up yet for the person after this intervention?
Well, I think the advice that I would give to the family is for the family to first receive the proper training and education to do an intervention of any kind. I think, as with anything, if you go about it the wrong way, it can be much more harmful than helpful to that individual. Yep. And so I'm a little concerned. Well, so hopefully they're not too resistant to getting that information, the family, because I think what they might learn just during the journey in terms of becoming more aware and through the educational process is the importance of providing that individual with the most support you can. So obviously family for sure would be great, but to expand that out and beyond the family would only help them through this process. And so that's what I would say is I would actually, before anybody intervenes, they need to focus on getting the proper knowledge to do that.
Mm-hmm.
That was my question, actually, Francine.
Hi.
And It was, I'm a natural therapist and doing an African cultural practice. And, but years ago, I did, well, I had some experience in my own personal family. It unfortunately didn't prevent a brother who later decided to kill himself. So, but it happened this way. He didn't tell us he was in the last stages of a heart congestive failure condition, and it didn't make sense. I just saw him cleaning out his garage. I lived next to him, and he was cleaning out the garage, and he had told me he wanted to do a big garage sale of things he'd been collecting over the years, but he didn't have a computer. And I said, why don't you let me set something up for you, and I'll help you. But I noticed he became very angry in his response. So that didn't kind of like match. Why are you doing all this work and you don't want to, set it up the proper way to have a sale, and you don't want help? At the time, it didn't occur to me that it was the voice. It was a change of voice. It was that angry tone that came up that was off, off, off. And after he died, he had destroyed all his personal papers. And I thought, well, this is all signs of wanting to die. And then when I looked on his counter, he had been taking I counted the medication because I was a nurse's aide and a home health aide years ago, and that's one of the things we have to do and I did hospice work, so you have to help people manage their meds. So I counted, for some reason, he kept the receipts about his medication. It's almost as if it was a sign he left to say to somebody that would recognize a sign, is that I actually decided to to go. So, we have these laws that, a person can elect to die, stop taking their medication. So it's a terrible controversy in the family of, did he kill himself or did he not kill himself? Did his heart, because his heart failed, but yet I'd counted the tablets. He was very meticulous about getting his medication like 2 weeks before it ran out. And at that, right before he died, I counted 3 weeks, almost 3.5 weeks of medication that he hadn't taken according to the sequence of his prescriptions. So that was a sneaky way of leaving us but he left signs. Why would all of his personal papers be gone? Why would his photos be gone? His personal photos and stuff. And then I had to go through his telephone book, and I found a company that was contracted by the hospital. It was like a support group, and they went over, the do's and don'ts for maintaining your health with the congestive heart failure. And he hadn't called them in like a year. So my and then the doctor demanded to have an autopsy because he hadn't consulted with my brother in about 2 years. So our question was, how unethical was it for that same doctor to keep prescribing my brother medication without seeing him in 2 years? So now we're looking at the racism side of it. Is that, did you do this because my brother was Black? Mm-hmm. And how could you, and a company that was contracted, and this is a second case of a person, not by suicide, but I don't know what happened to the other person, but they had a heart condition, an elderly Eritrean woman, but she had this little tiny cell phone, and she didn't even know how to replace the battery. The battery was there. I had to go to the store for her. I just met her in public at a delicatessen or something. She was on a walker. She lived across the street, and I helped her with her soup. And then with her she spoke better Italian than she did English. And I figured it out that what she had to do is she couldn't get a visa to the United States. The closest visa she could get was to go to Italy. She worked as a domestic in Italy, and then from there she got a visa to come to the United States. And and her relative was like in Texas or something, and nobody was realizing this woman needs a house phone, like my brother. He needed a house telephone, not this stupid device that could, I don't want to say stupid device, but that could, the battery could run out. And that was the other thing. We kept calling him and his recording was there. Even though he hadn't paid on his Metro phone, the recording was there, making us believe that he was receiving the messages. It didn't even give that message that, when people haven't paid their bill. So we had no clues that way. And finally, we just had to open his apartment. As my mother had a key, and I had to go in before my mother in this terrible thing. So it then I noticed the effect it had on the family. People were just all over the place, and the same thing of this family I'm talking about. A young man who's in college. He's my client, and I have been tracking him ever since he mentioned having to go and get this relative with his mother, and I thought he was safe and they were getting him care. Apparently he's not getting any psychological care. He's just completely isolated himself, and he didn't tell me that the guy has tried to kill himself like twice. And it was very complicated, this family, because the uncle, his uncle is white, his mother is black, and I'm like, I couldn't wrap my mind around this. I couldn't even recommend black groups for him to get supported by. I was blindsided by the fact I didn't know any white young male in their 30s groups to recommend him to. It was just, you know what I'm saying? It was to try to step into a situation, but I've noticed seeing his decline. He's becoming less open in his sessions than he was before because of this incident that's happening. And now I'm getting this subtle transference of his anger and little sabotages to it. This was the first time within the week that he actually said he was on his job trying to, where I'm like, there was nobody around, but still it was just the idea that he was on his job while he wanted me to give him a session. I mean, because there was nobody around, I went ahead and went with that, but I kept noticing his angry features that he was trying to hide from me, but not really, because he'd never done that before.
Yeah, I definitely think what Dolores mentioned in terms of the QPR training might be especially helpful for you right now, because that's really all about kind of giving you the questions to ask. A lot of times we tend to think that if we ask the wrong question, or if we ask a person if they're feeling suicidal, that might drive them to actually do it. But the research shows that is very clearly a myth. But there are some specific questions that you can ask to really help a person to feel more comfortable sharing that they are feeling suicidal. But then the training also will equip you with those tools to, kind of persuade, nudge, encourage, whatever you want to call it, them to get some help, and then give you the proper tools to refer them out to a licensed mental health counselor, therapist to help them further. So I would highly recommend that for you, because it seems like you've had, or you encounter these sorts of things, and it'll just empower you to feel more comfortable knowing what to do. Because from what I hear from you, it's almost like, well, I feel like I've done everything I can. I don't know what else I can do. So maybe something like that would be very helpful for you. And I think the training is only 1 hour. And it's a great opportunity to take advantage of that.
Where's the training? Because I'm sorry, I stepped into this late. I checked my calendar.
I'm glad
sometimes Eventbrite doesn't put that there for you to put it in the calendar. I don't know, but anyway, because I checked it last night and I didn't see any workshops. How would I get information about this QPR training?
In the follow-up email, we would definitely include the link to where you can sign up for the training, and as well as resources that Dolores was speaking of.
Because I have some other complex issues. I have a nephew who's was getting training to become a pastor, and I identified that his pastor was like, I would I would say it in the words that my grandmother, my ancestor Baptist, would say, he's not a sanctified minister. I noticed that immediately when I called to, I noticed my nephew was getting angrier and angrier, and I tried to call, and there was an incident in the family, and I tried to call the pastor, and the pastor said, "Oh, I'm not a pastor of this church." Although I spoke to his secretary, and I thought, "Oh, this is really awful. My poor nephew is having a crisis, and this unsanctified minister is associated with it." And so I'm like, wow, where do you go from that? And he recently had a nervous breakdown, and because of the COVID-19, right before that, he decided to quit his job and to do full-time before he'd even been trained as a minister. And I met pastors in my area who they went to school, they worked a day job, and they worked as part-time ministers. They worked together. So nobody was like uh, uh, giving up their day job to be a pastor. I feel that he let go of all of these supports. And then when COVID-19 hit, and he didn't have support from this minister, uh, I'm just assuming he didn't have support from the minister, because I
Yeah.
talked to him myself, and the guy was just like, he had
Mm,
this cruelty to him. So
yeah.
I'm like, so where do you recommend somebody like that?
I, I
Um,
I think there is a variety of different things and resources that we will definitely put together for you as it relates to some of those things, and so because some things are just choices in that people make, in that we can't violate a person's choice for something. We don't know how things are going to turn out, or anything of that nature. And so, but let us just put together these resources for you, send them to you, and then we can definitely go from there. And then we want to open the floor up for others with some Q&A at this point.
okay, thank you.
Mhm. All right. All right, Dr. Kamesha, we thank you for your time today.
Pleasure.
And
Thank
thank everyone else for your time and logging on. Um, there's a couple things that we will include in there. Also be looking for emails from Ms. Dolores Williams as it relates to what the Mental Health Board is going to do to follow up to equip churches to deal with mental health, and so that we can have those things there. I will say, if you are a pastor or you're close to your pastor, then I would also suggest that you all get together and be thinking about who can champion certain things within your congregation, which is, one of the things I like to work with, is that when we work with pastors and we're working around community-based issues or things that affect lives, if you can find one person to champion that, to keep everybody else abreast and trained and how to do that, we are seeing a increase across the country. Before COVID hit, we were seeing an increase of mental health outbursts and issues arising in the middle of worship services, and people were not trained to effectively deal with them. And so we want to make sure that even as we are going, churches are gearing back up for worship and in-person worship, that 2020 has taken a toll on a lot of people. And so we want to make sure your churches are equipped to deal with these things, even as you are calling. I know a lot of churches have call uh, buddies and stuff like that. As you're calling people that are not doing well, we want to make sure that you are abreast and know what resources you can use in order to get them the help that they need. And then also, we are, I don't know if you all had a chance to view this. There was a pastor who was having mental health issues due to loss of job and certain things that just arise just here in 2020. And so because he was having a manic episode, his family called for a officer to come out, or somebody trained in mental health to come out to the house. When they called 911, they sent the officer out. The officer came to the door, and as the officer was walking away, the man went out talking to him, raising his hands, and at that point, the officer tased him and then shot him 3 times. And so, and this is a pastor. And so one of the things that that has just rested on me, and so what I'm doing is, for those who are who have worked in this area, who feel like they have some expertise to share, we are putting together a forum so that we can share with pastors and that we can get them the proper help that they need as we talk to pastors that definitely that we cover and oversee. You know, a lot of them are stressed. A lot of them are just don't know what to do. And so I think this is a good time to, in fact, impart wisdom, to share resources with them, but also help them understand that this is we can create a safe space for them. And so if you're interested in being a part of this forum, please email me directly, and so that we can put together time for us to meet and then get those things planned and get you the dates that we need. And so I'm going to put my email in the chat, and you can just contact me and let me know what your expertise is and how you feel like you can aid in this effort to reach pastors. And I'm going to hand it back off to Ms. Dolores Williams.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you, Dr. Kamesha. We have been connected and working together for some time now. It's really good that you could step in and help us on this particular effort. And then thanks to all of you that tuned in today. As a follow-up, we really want to keep this effort going with this particular subgroup and need input from you. So if you've got ideas or you're thinking about ways that the Mental Health Board can continue to support and educate, increasing awareness, don't hesitate to shoot me an email and just give me your ideas, or call if you want to just chat and brainstorm about some things that the Mental Health Board might be able to partner with you on. Thanks for tuning in. I believe there is a survey, Charles, correct?
Yes, there will be a survey in the follow-up email.
All right. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. You too. Bye, everyone.